Israel gained independence and recognition by the UN as a Jewish state in 1948. Immediately after Israel gained its independence, the other regional powers in the area declared war on Israel, beginning the First Arab-Israeli War. Eventually, Israel won the war, preserved its independence, and achieved a national identity. In 1956, Israel participated in the Suez War to weaken its neighbor Egypt. It did so with the help of the United Kingdom and France, but when those powers left the area and Israel was by itself, the Arab powers were looking for ways to wipe Israel off the map. They attempted to do this in the Six-Day War of 1967 and changed the political landscape in the Middle East in ways that they likely didn't imagine.
The tensions rising from the Israeli War of Independence and Egypt's humiliation in the Suez War led to anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli rhetoric from both Egypt under President Gamal Abdel Nasser and Syria under Hafez al-Assad. Parades in the streets of Cairo and posters saying "Push the Jews out of Palestine and into the sea" were said to be seen before the outbreak of the war. Nasser also encouraged Arab unity and hosted several conferences prior to the outbreak of the Six-Day War with Syria, Jordan, as well as other independent Arab nations to deal with Israel. The Soviet Union declared solidarity with the Arab powers, and in response, American support for Israel began to increase. The United States under President Lyndon B. Johnson insisted that Israel not strike first and allow the Arab powers to begin the inevitable war to come. Ignoring the president's advice, on June 5, 1967, at 7:45 a.m., Israel launched a preemptive attack on the Egyptian Air Force. The attack on Egypt was a decisive success, with some sources indicating that as much as 80% of the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed in a single day. This loss amounted to over 280 modern jet fighters that were given to Egypt by the Soviet Union. The Israeli Air Force used special bombs designed to destroy runways, so that way Israel would not only destroy the Air Force, but make it difficult for Egypt to use what little air power it still had left. The superiority achieved by Israeli planes allowed for successful operation to occur throughout the Sinai Peninsula. One Egyptian officer famously said, "Our Air Force had been training for parades, not for war." On the second day of the war, Radio Cairo released false statements of victory for the Egyptian Air Force and even stated that Egyptian troops were in Israeli territory. The Egyptian public cheered for Nasser and declared that, "Tonight we dine in Tel Aviv." Israel, on the other hand, only released a statement that said the war had begun in order to prevent an imposed ceasefire from the United Nations and preventing a decisive Israeli victory. During that time, Israeli troops were defeating the Egyptian army in the Sinai thanks to undisputed air superiority. On June 6, the second day of the war, Israeli paratroopers landed in Jerusalem and began attacking Jordanian positions within the Old City. In order to preserve the sanctity of the city, Israeli troops avoided using tanks or artillery. Eventually, the paratroopers had managed to take a large portion of the Old City, including the Jewish quarter, which was a major political victory for Israel. During June 7th and 8th, Israel had managed to capture most of the city of Jerusalem, including the Wailing Wall, allowing Jews to pray there for the first time since 1948, and also managed to push the Egyptian army back to near the Suez Canal. During this phase of the fighting in Sinai, Israel only lost 275 soldiers, while Egyptian losses numbered over 10,000. On June 8th, Israeli leaders announced that they would accept a ceasefire, as did Egyptian leaders. Syria and Iraq, however, did not accept the ceasefire. Together, the Soviet Union threatened to sever diplomatic relations with Israel if they continued to attack Syria or Egypt. On June 9th and 10th, the last 2 days of fighting, the central and northern Israeli army groups approached the plateau through a pincer movement. To their surprise, many of the areas were left abandoned and Syrians started to blow up bunkers and burn documents. Syria finally acknowledged the idea that it would have to accept a ceasefire. Radio Damascus announced the fall of the Syrian city Quneitra hours before it actually happened, which destroyed the morale of Syrian troops and caused the Syrian troops on the Golan Heights to retreat, putting the region under Israeli control. By the war's end, Gaza, the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights were under Israeli control.
The political fallout in Egypt was almost immediate. Due to his nation's humiliating defeat in the Six-Day War, Nasser resigned from the presidency of Egypt. It was said that after his resignation, Nasser was in a state of mental and emotional distress, which would persist during his tenure as prime minister later. Jordan also had a major crisis, having not only lost the West Bank and all of the natural resources within it, but the loss of this territory also precipitated a major refugee crisis, as thousands of Palestinians left their homes and moved into Jordanian territory. This resulted in factions such as the Palestine Liberation Organization forming. The PLO attacked Jordanian infrastructure, killed Jordanian politicians, and fomented unrest throughout the country. Due to the Six-Day War, the political situation in Jordan was a disaster. Diplomatically, Israel was isolated from its neighbors. No Arab power was willing to sell oil to Israel, resulting in a major fuel crisis. No regional power was willing to aid Israel in a future war either, and as a result, in later wars, Israel would have to rely on the United States for aid. Almost immediately after the occupation of Jerusalem, Israel took steps towards removing the Arab population from the area. Parts of the Arab quarter in the Old City were demolished so that the Jewish quarter would have access to the Wailing Wall, something they had not had since 1948. Israeli forces also removed Palestinians from the Old Arab quarter and put Israeli Jews in their place. Between the Arab powers, there was a large amount of revanchism. As a result, a new conflict was inevitable, which took place in the form of the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War, which began on the highest of the Jewish holy days on October 6, 1973, was an attempt by Egypt and Syria, with some help from Jordan, to reclaim the lands they lost in the Six-Day War. At first, the Egyptians managed to break through Israeli defenses, but eventually the war turned in Israel's favor, and by the end of the conflict on October 25, 1973, Israel had surrounded the Egyptian Third Army, pushed them back across the Suez Canal, and began to shell Damascus and Syria. Once again, a UN-brokered ceasefire took effect, but neither Egypt nor Syria recognized Israel. After the Yom Kippur War ended, ideas of peace between Israel and Egypt were appealing to both sides. In 1978, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat visited Israel, the first time an Egyptian head of state had done so. Sadat spoke to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, about the desire for peace both countries shared. The United States under President Jimmy Carter urged Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat to sign the Camp David Accords in 1978. The main focus of the peace treaty was territories occupied by Israel during the Six-Day War. In this case, Israel agreed to cede the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in return for recognition as a nation. This was the first time Israel and any of its Arab neighbors had reached a compromise together. The political upheaval resulting from the Six-Day War truly reshaped the Middle East. While the war only lasted 6 days, the political implications that resulted would persist for years to come. The issue with Palestine is yet to be dealt with. The Golan Heights remain under Israeli control, and Gaza is currently under an Israeli blockade. Despite this, the Six-Day War did result in one positive thing: a peace process between Israel and at least one of its neighbors. Because of the massive territorial changes and the tensions that were created between Israel and its neighbors, the Six-Day War had a profound impact on the political situation in the Middle East.